Welcome to Untangling Traditions. Today we'll be speaking with Professor Dagmar Wujastyk, the Principal Investigator of AyurYog, Entangled Histories of Yoga, Ayurveda and Alchemy in South Asia. Dagmar is a Sanskritist who specializes in the pre-modern literature of Indian medicine, Ayurveda, Yoga and Alchemy, Rasahṛdayatatra. Welcome, Dagmar. So what led you to research the literature of pre-modern Indian alchemy?
So this goes back to a project that I did before this one, before AyurYog, in which I was looking at Indian medical literature, the Sanskrit literature of Ayurveda, and I was looking at changes in this literature and therefore in the practice. And I noticed that a lot of the changes that were happening in Ayurveda started around the 10th, 11th century, and that these changes were about which substances were used, namely there was suddenly a heightened use of minerals and metals, but more significantly, the ways in which these materials were used, namely that these metals and minerals would have to be processed before being added to formulations. And as I looked into this and was asking myself what happened, what made these changes happen, I saw that at the same time, this new literature had arisen, alchemical literature, and that these changes to Ayurvedic medicine were due to what I think of as a dialogue with alchemy, with Rasashastra. So this first spawned my interest in alchemical literature. And as I was looking at the secondary literature on this discipline, I noted there's very little on it. And I think probably most famous writing on it is by David Gordon White, who wrote The Alchemical Body, which is all about how the alchemists had the same aims and often the same methods as yogis, as the practitioners of Hatha Yoga or medieval yoga. So I wondered a bit, since this work, this very important and pioneering work, didn't really speak about medicine so much, I was thinking that this role of the entanglement between alchemy and medicine should be just examined a bit more closely, and to see also whether we could find a commonality between all three disciplines, so yoga, Ayurveda and alchemy. And this is basically what gave birth to the AyurYog project as a whole.
Yes, and you've been currently working on a reader of Indian alchemy. Can you tell us more about this?
Working on the project, I have noticed that most people are familiar with yoga nowadays. Most people practice yoga in some form or other, and more people know about Indian classical medicine or Ayurveda as well. But Indian alchemy is something that people are not very aware of, and they don't really know how it interplays with either yoga or with medicine, even though it's really an integral part of modern day Ayurveda, for example. So the reader is supposed to give an introduction to Indian alchemy and based on the Sanskrit literature of Indian alchemy.
So tell us a little more about the literature of alchemy.
Around the 9th or the 10th centuries of the Common Era, alchemists in India began to compose works about their craft, and they described both their goals and the methods with which they hoped to achieve their goals. So this gave rise to a new genre of literature, Rasashastra literature. The word Rasashastra is a Sanskrit compound word of rasa, which in this case probably means mercury, and shastra, which is something like learned discipline or body of knowledge. So this is the discipline of mercury for Rasashastra. And this new genre of literature set practices that were previously the stuff of legend within a framework of a learned discipline with formal boundaries. And it was a both spiritual and practical discipline that these alchemists were describing. So the practitioners of Indian alchemy, of Rasashastra, considered goals such as making gold or lengthening lifespan, attaining superhuman powers or siddhis, and entering transcendent states achievable through technical means, specifically through making mercurial elixirs and then taking them or applying them both to metals and to the human body. So So this literature was new, not in that it describes a new discipline. I think alchemy had been around for a longer time, or Rasashastra had been, but rather in that it describes these practices as part of a learned discipline.
Interesting. So you've been using the word Rasa Shastra and alchemy interchangeably. So is the word alchemy appropriate?
Yeah, this is a question I have been asking myself quite a lot, because it seems to me through my research that the Western alchemical tradition, so the one that arose in ancient Greece and then was refound and developed in Arabic cultures, where then the word actually arises, alchemia, that then leads to alchemy, and which then was brought into Europe, does not seem to have a lot of historical connection with the Indian tradition. So there are many commonalities, especially, the use of mercury and the ways in which mercury is used. But the Western traditions seem quite markedly different from the Indian one, in that the Indian one in its early literature really emphasizes spiritual aims, which the Western tradition does not. It instead has a very strong emphasis on making gold. We do have making gold in the Indian alchemical tradition, but it gets much less emphasis than in the Western tradition. Nevertheless, I think for practical reasons, because of the kinds of associations we have when we hear the word alchemy, it's a close enough fit to work. But then I do like to sometimes just use the word Rasashastra or Rasavidya, the knowledge about mercury, just to make sure that we know we are talking about a separate tradition.
That's interesting that you were speaking about these different goals and methods of alchemy within the Indian context. Did you want to elaborate a little more on those achievements of cities and so forth?
Now we're looking at a literature that spans, the 10th century, maybe even the 9th century, up to the present. There was a lot of textual production, and in all this literature, we do see different developments. So goals and aims and ideas change over time, but from the beginning, we can see sort of two broad trends of what Indian alchemists were hoping to achieve. And basically, the first aim was about Loha Siddhi, or the perfection of metals. And the other was Deha Siddhi, the perfection of the body. And the perfection of metals basically refers to the making of gold or silver, so, making precious metals. And sometimes you get this idea that it's really the making of, so a transmutation process where maybe lead or copper indeed become gold or silver. And sometimes you get the sense that it's really about imitation, so faking this making of precious metals. In the case of the perfection of the body, this is a wider range of goals. It can span from just giving the user of the mercurial elixir perfect health, but also lengthening lifespans, sometimes up to immortality, sometimes giving them special powers, so extra strength, very often special sexual power, so sexual stamina and so on is one of the very important goals in Indian alchemy, in some texts at least. And then we also have transcendent goals, so reaching a state, a condition that is like Shiva, the absolute God. So all of these varying goals fall under the idea of the perfection of the body, because the idea is that all of this happens within a living body rather than something that is achieved after death.
Fascinating. I think that there's a lot of overlay there between the perfection of the body and these types of goals, and the cities that are somewhat assumed to be attainable through a yoga practice, which is quite interesting. Since you're looking at the textual record that spans from the 10th century through to the 18th century, it's quite a large span of time. What do you see as some of the trends or major developments in the alchemical tradition?
So there's a lot of commonality between the different works of this literature, because many of the newer works use quotations from the older ones. So a work that dates to the 15th century, for example, called the Rasaratnasamuccaya, the jewel heap of mercury, which is one of these sort of very important works, is basically a compilation of works that were composed previously. And so this goes through all of alchemical literature. Things recur again and again, but then you see things that change over time. And I think what we can generally see is that there is a divide between alchemical works, and this starts from the very beginning, from the earliest works that were transmitted to us. So this divide is between works that have a stronger religious, typically Shaiva tantric element, and those that don't. So for the early works, you have the Rasahṛdayatantra, the Heart of Mercury, which is doesn't have many religious elements, but it does have transcendent goals. And you have the Rasarnava, which the Ocean of Mercury, maybe written a century after the Rasahṛdaya, which has so many tantric elements and many religious elements. So you have the use of mantra, you have the use of diagrams and so on. So this divide goes through all of alchemical literature. So some of these works kind of lend themselves more to seeing the alchemical tradition as a sort of proto-scientific tradition, and the other kind of alchemical work lends itself more to seeing it as an expression of religiosity. So that's one big pattern that I can see from the work on the Alchemy Reader. And another trend that we can see over time, I suppose, in all works, is that the alchemical endeavor seems to slowly move away from transcendent goals and ideas, ideas of creating, for example, a superhuman, so the mentioned cities and so on, and immortality, to instead focus on medicine or to the imitation or making of precious metals. So in other words, we do have a sort of general trend away from transcendent goals to more mundane goals aimed at making gold or at sort of improving the bodily condition.
So one aspect of your research has been to not only look at the literature, but then also experiment with reconstruction. So the reconstruction of the alchemy lab, and then also some of the procedures. Would you like to just hint at some of that for now?
This goes back to, so the chapters that I'm contributing to the Alchemy Reader are chapters from this 11th century work that I mentioned already, or 10th century, 11th century work, the Heart of Mercury, the Rasahṛdayatantra. And I was looking at it because it describes in one of its chapters the procedures of how to make the mercurial elixir. And as I was translating this chapter, I was struck at just how concise the descriptions were. And I was really wondering what the work was used for. Was this a manual that allowed practitioners to look up procedures, like how do I do the first procedure for cleansing mercury? How do I do the second procedure for waking it up or potentiating it or so? And so I thought we could try this out and see how easy or how hard it would be to follow these instructions. And I've been working with somebody in the UK, Andrew Mason, who has had some training in iatrochemistry. So in the medical part of Rasashastra, he learned this type of Rasashastra on Sri Lanka, and he was willing to try out to see whether we could follow some of these instructions. And we've been working on that. In fact, we've been working on that since October, so it's been many months, and we're currently at procedure 5. So what was a very short, concise description in the text turned out to be a very elaborate and difficult and time-consuming procedure once you actually try to do it.
Fantastic. We really look forward to seeing some of the material come to light, and your ability to sort of reconstruct the past in a way, like in what we're calling embodied philology, bringing these historical practices to life. So when do you think the reader will be ready for publication?
We're almost done with the draft of the reader. There's still maybe 3 or 4 articles are missing. We are looking at a selection of about 11 alchemical works. So we made a selection of the most prominent alchemical work starting from probably the 9th or 10th century up to the 18th century. Each alchemical work was chosen for its importance for the tradition, but also then we chose excerpts from it, typically a full chapter, that would exemplify key themes of alchemy. So what kinds of topics were Indian alchemists engaged with? And it's quite a rich source for understanding Indian alchemy. We've got most of it done, so there's still a few things that we need to finish up with. So if the draft is finished in the summer, then I would expect the publication to be out within the next year. But in the meantime, we have been writing little summaries on our website. We have a blog on AyurYog.org. Where you can see some of the work that we've been doing on the reader for a first glimpse into the sorts of themes that readers will learn about.
So you're opening up a new field, Dagmar, which is extremely exciting, and I'm sure we're, myself and also many readers are looking forward to the opportunity to delve into this literature for the first time. So thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.